Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session of the Depthwise and the Diagonal by Reza Negarestani. This four-session seminar undertakes an analysis of the structure of world history to adopt Kojin Karatani's term for organizing phenomena and processes which span across historical, economic, religious, political, and mass psychological horizons. The analysis will be conducted in the vein of a synthesis between horizontalists and verticalists, where the difference between the two is often understood in terms of the emphasis put on the contrast between networks and bottom-up processes on the one hand, and hierarchical models equipped with a central command and control on the other. By reconceptualizing organizational structures as operating in a space that combines aspects of hierarchical and networked models, this seminar will examine contemporary frameworks in political, economic, and social systems, increasing failure to address the challenges posed by complex systems that do not fit neatly into either horizontalist or verticalist paradigms. The structures shaping history reflect iterations that cut across these traditionally understood categories. This is the model of the depth, understood computationally as a blend of these dimensions across scales of an organization, which is precisely what you must strive to comprehend in order to address the shortcomings of how we describe the structure of whole history. Given that your inventive practice aimed at the structure of whole history are beholden to how we describe and explain it first. Then a notion of diagonal depth is necessary for describe phenomena which, despite their appearances, are neither truly horizontal nor vertical. The design, this seminar integrates insights from political science, economics, complexity theory, and computer science to propose a conceptual framework adequate for analyzing historical evolutions and organizations and systems manifesting them. A number of concepts and framework adequate to the task of describing such systems will be introduced, including Charles Bennett logical depth, Paul Vitanil and Ming Li's work on Kolmogorov complexity and its applications. Andre Ersman memory evolutive systems, Aurora Apolito on the problem of scale in anarcho-communism, and Hemobadi Antonio Politi's work on hierarchical and scaling problems in complexity science will be adapted to highlight the labor involved in interpreting and transforming them. Haza?
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for coming. As I said, please do forgive me. I might once in a while just pause and have a fresh breath. I have a little bit of a lung problem these days. This doesn't mean that I'm not going to smoke, though. I will just try to be minimizing that procedure. Uh, so. This course is kind of something that I wanted to talk about for a long time because it kind of or present it because it's kind of like a distillation of some of the threads I have been working on before writing Intelligence and Spirit, right? Some of my old works and the idea of navigation, particularly concept navigation and explication. And there was this seminar that Pete Wolfendale, me, and Armena Venetian organized, I think it was 2014 in Hackaway, which brought, a number of friends, a number of new voices. And it was centered on a topic called emancipation as navigation. I think the write-up is still there, and most probably you would be able to find some of the podcasts or recordings. And of course, back in the day, navigation, the idea of the concept navigation for me was the best tool for expressing it was what you might call to be, in the formal sense, was category theory and topos theory, higher algebra, geometric sort of tools in mathematics. But then I was convinced that, that is a little bit like cutting the corners, and it kind of has that sort of fidelity to mathematics that I no longer fully endorse. Given the fact that, philosophy, every time that it tries to be what you might call to be serious or consequential in terms of its theorization, it resorts to mathematical truths, right? Given the fact of the kind of a maximal proximity between mathematics and philosophy at the dawn of time, right? At the dawn of philosophy. But this also creates a number of, I would say, blind spots and slippery slopes down the roads for philosophy. So I moved from the idea of navigation, concept navigation, and of course I will talk about what navigation simply means, toward different sorts of methodologies and different forms of expression, computer science, mechanistic philosophy, complexity theory, and so on and so forth. So the next, I remember that the next phase of this navigation, emancipation as navigation, was a seminar that I gave at the New Center on complexity and computation. I can't remember. I think it was 12 sessions. It was huge. And I talked about so many of these, tropes and themes that I'm going to actually address them in this seminar as well. And then came intelligence and spirit. And then, of course, nothing happened. I started to genuinely deviate from that, what you might call to be that the strand of philosophy, for personal reasons, but also, philosophers usually do deviate from one context, from one arena to another. And that was around the time 3 years ago when I started to, entertain reading political philosophy and being more serious about, the idea of emancipation and thinking of emancipation as navigation of the spaces of possibility and different worlds. In terms of, a more, what you might call to be explicit form of political philosophy. This in tandem with, the war in Gaza, kind of what was catapulted to a new height by it, to the point that I thought that, okay, maybe I should actually give seminars on, for example, the Iranian Revolution, the history of Islamic Revolution, 1979 revolution. And, the Middle East, which have been two of my most recent seminars in the past 2 or 3 years. And so with all of this, then I thought that, okay, maybe I should go back and revisit some of the work that I had done in a more formal sense, looking at complexity, look at the idea of organization, look at the idea of systems, interaction, navigation, so on and so forth, from the perspective of now, right? What is the perspective of now? This here and now, right now, right? Our president has been re-elected. And you know who I'm talking about, after the 12-day war on Iran, and so many other, what you might say, events that have happened. It would be extremely hasty to even try to list them, as in order to talk about the level of calamity, the level of how fast things are unraveling. So by no means the seminar is going to give any sort of, because my job is being a philosopher. I'm not a politician and I'm not a political theorist, and I don't want to pretend to be one at all. So as a philosopher, my job is instead of giving a sort of prescription at all, giving a little bit of a tools and devices to my audience at this point to rethink and expand the vocabularies, but also imagining new methodologies for us to approach the sort of phenomena, political phenomena, and socioeconomic phenomena that we are confronted with today. So to do that, however, requires me to, to have this in mind, that my audience, in fact, I should presuppose this from the get-go, that my audience most probably is not familiar with this discourse, even though they might be Marxists who have, read here and there a bit about organization, about systems, about cybernetics, so on and so forth, or political philosophy in general, or philosophy in general. I assume that I'm not preaching to the faithful, because majority of you are the faithful. So it would be absurd for me to preach to the faithful. That is not what I'm trying to do. Instead, I'm trying to think of you as an audience who are coming from different facets of political orientations. And I do not want to assume in advance what political positions or orientations you might have. So in that sense, I'm trying to be very general as possible in terms of treating you as my audience. And for that matter, I present materials on a neutral ground. When it is necessary to criticize them, I will try to, but when it is not, I will just describe them, because I think that what we are essentially embarked upon in this seminar is going to be an attempt at a more accurate description or set of descriptions of what we are dealing with right now. So what we are dealing here at present. So this is why, again, assuming the neutral ground, I propose for us to read the introduction to A Structure of World History by Kojin Karatani. This doesn't mean that by any means I actually agree with its main points. That is beside the point, that whether I agree with it or not. But I thought that it is precisely because of the title, The Structure of World History, which is a magnificent title, by the way. And the way that it tries to, or it attempts to cover something which is related to the history, but also the structure of world history, which is essentially what we are trying to deal with. However, in the present, and for that, in the present, we need one, an account of history, and two, the organization of history, the structure of history, and the structure of the organization. So, given what we are set to investigate, describing what we are dealing with, I thought that Karatani's work would be an optimal, for now, an optimal point of entrance. And so as, the works of Charles Bennett, Ersman, Paul Vitanier, Mingley, and many others who have been included in the syllabus. So, without further ado, I want to start. Oh, and of course, so this session, so just giving you a heads up as how we are going to proceed. So this session, I'm starting to, I will make some scattered attempts at touching different slices of the problem, dealing with what we are dealing here and now. Yeah. So addressing the problem of phenomenology, either transcendental or objective phenomenology, right? Because we are dealing with phenomena which are somehow, we are not just ill-equipped to deal with them, to understand them, but we don't know exactly what they are, right? That is something. So that's the problem of complexity and organization, some of the basic introductions. And for those who are interested, you can go and look at the seminar on complexity and computation that I had given many years ago for more details. But I think that it would be necessary for us to move forward to have a little bit of introduction on some central concepts, central themes, when we are talking about organization, when we are talking about structure, political or otherwise, right? About history, and of course, all of these concentrated within the premises set by our point of entry, which that would be Karatani's The Structure of World History. And then in the course of the next sessions, we are going to unfold this to see whether Karatani's Structure of World History abides by its promises, at which points it falls short, at which points it can be repaired, and this will give us a certain sort of a more robust way of thinking about how we can approach the understanding of political organization, and hence collective political organization, and hence the idea of emancipation, right? How to think emancipation. Well, before we go do the practice on the streets or in the world, I think it is necessary for us to have sufficient at least here and now, sufficient, not sufficient tomorrow, because sufficiency for our vocabularies is always something that is tethered to here and now. Something that is sufficient might be sufficient today, might not be sufficient tomorrow, right? But for here and now. An attempt before going and talking about how we should deal with the world, with these phenomena, such as capitalism, such as apartheid, such as, activism, political organization at different scales. We should have a presently sufficient, or attempting at arriving at presently sufficient set or armamentarium of vocabularies, descriptive vocabularies, in order to say what it is that we are dealing with, right? And even if we can say what it is we are dealing with, at least we need to understand how we can describe something that has created a point of alienation, cognitive alienation for us. Yeah. Whether that would be capitalism, apartheid, this or that. So this is going to be kind of like the rough pathway that we are trying to carve out throughout this seminar. So before starting, and of course we need to have introduction. Should we do the introduction, people introducing themselves right now, or should we do it at the end?
I think in the next session, it's better
Okay.
in the next session.
Okay. Okay. So before I move forward, now that you most probably have read texts for today's session, I want to see if you have questions or thoughts instead of introduction, such that the materials that I have prepared, I can tie in some of your concerns from the get-go. So questions about the text that we have read, that would be one by Bennett, and the other one, the introduction to Karatani's book, The Structure of World History. And please, you can steal microphone from me because I need to have a little bit of a breath. I cannot these days talk in a straight for 10 minutes. Anyone? Any thoughts? No matter how trivial it might look like it, please, Neil.
Hi, Reza. Hello, everyone. I hope I can, this question's not very kind of, broad brushstroke, but it just kind of comes out of a combination of the two texts, the Bennett and the Karatani, and where I have to say there are certain things in the Bennett I find difficult to grasp. So, I may be kind of, not really formulating a great question here, but let's see. So I just thought it was kind of interesting that there's a distinction that he makes, the Bennett, he moving from function to structure. And with that also then, going into talking about logical depth and universal computation. And I was wondering how that, for me, how I read across to Karatani was where, Karatani's critique of Marx, where he's, taking the emphasis away from, mode of production to mode of exchange. And I was just kind of really interested in where going from functionality, to structure, that the way that Bennett talks about sort of functionality, in the sense that he's talking about, looking at systems, and how systems simulate each other, simulate the dynamics, of each other, and that under the paradigm of functionality, that this actually means that we're missing out sort of potential information, because there's under functionality we're talking about sort of meaning and reference, in the sort of encoding, under function, and so then that he's kind of saying that there's a sort of loss of possible information there, and that and I was just really interested in going over to Karatani and sort of looking at where potentially this idea, is opened out in a way by Karatani, where he wants to talk about exchange, of systems, and their interrelation.
Intercourse.
Yes.
The intercourse, the German word.
Yeah, exactly. And that really he's not talking about, he's trying to get away from Marx's sort of triangulation, around the function of labor and its exploitation, and the idea of resting surplus, and so he wants to get away from that functional sort of formalism. So he wants to get into talking about structure and interrelation and exchange. And I wondered, is there in the background of this, and Karatani doesn't really situate it in this way, but it also occurs to me that there's some kind of implicit critique of the mode of representation, and a reference frame, under a kind of, and under critiques of representation, let's say, that we will have, so that there's, in Marx, there's more as Karatani is sort of seeing it under the mode of production, a sort of a reference frame for the mode of production, and the understanding of its value, and as I said, using surplus and exploiting labor, so that there's a kind of functional model there, whereas he wants to make it more about structural, exchange, and go back to pre-capital and look at reciprocity.
Absolutely.
And exchange,
yes.
and sort of systems of circulation and flow. So I know it's a very rambling kind of, sort of point there I'm making.
No. It's quite clear, actually. No. That's completely clear, and absolutely that's the case. So obviously, when Bennett talks about functionalism, it talks about computational functionalism. Computational functionalism is essentially a form of a structuralism, not in a philosophical sense, because the word structuralism in philosophy is a very dubious sort of and quite ambivalent.
Yeah.
And but when we are talking about computational functionalism or functionalism in in these sort of avenues like theoretical computer science and stuff, functionalism is precisely the expression of the structure itself. So a structure is not a given in a sense, but in a Husserlian sense, we think about it, and that's why I'm going to talk about first from the standpoint of phenomenology. When we are looking at a system, right, we can never actually talk about what a system is, because that would be an absurd thing to say. It's as if we have some sort of backdoor access to the structure of things in themselves, right? We can only approach a system by way of how it behaves. And of course, its behavior or set of behaviors is coextensive with how we are presented to the system itself, meaning it's coextensive with our perspective, right? And it's coextensive with how we navigate a set of behaviors. This is famous René Thumb's adage that, that the system is like a black box. And the only way to unveil a black box is by playing with it. It's by playing with it in order to essentially unfold or initiate a set of behaviors. These are called tendencies, usually in dynamic systems. And then once we integrate these set of tendencies, then we are getting what you might call to be a slices of what the system might be. It's a structure. So functionality is entangled with a structure in this sense. And of course, Karatani, just like Bennett, but of course, he doesn't know anything about, complexity sciences, right? Or maybe he does, I don't know. But he doesn't talk about it in any of his works. He wants to essentially articulate this point that, moving from modes of production and kind of suspending, in a Husserlian way, suspending the process of epoche, the natural attitude which comes with our representational point of view, our individual experiences, and so on and so forth, as collective or as individuals, by suspending the natural and what you might call to be excessive philosophical attitudes toward, modes of production, value, and this sort of stuff. And instead, through a phenomenological reduction, and that's exactly what he talks about, securing some sort of generative grammar for forms of interactions which coexist always in residual forms in every sort of world history, and these are modes of exchange, then we can talk about how structures are being generated through precisely these interactions or intercourses, right? Which would be essentially a very functionalist thesis, right? And that also means that depending on how we manage to unfold or initiate or release certain sort of behaviors within a system, we can uncover slices of a system hitherto unknown to us, meaning that we can uncover new social forms, not only social forms, but in different contexts. These social forms and these sort of exchanges can lead to different possible worlds, right? And that would be, is pinnacle idea of the associationism, X, mode D, right? So yes, so there is absolutely, there is a compatibility between the sort of functionalism that Bennett is talking about, which is the functionalism in the system theory and system dynamics and computational complexity theory, with the understanding of a structure that he has in mind. A structuralism or a structural world history that is not given, but it can only be uncovered through its mode or manner of givenness. And the manner of givenness always implicate us as humans, as collective organizations, of how we organize ourselves and how we have certain sort of attitudes toward the system.
Yeah, so just one quick question on that is, so am I going off in a unhelpful direction to be aligning functionality with autonomy, autonomy in terms of organization of sort of system, and when you're talking about, yes, us as a system, and where he gets into talking about subjective complexity, I was getting also confused there about whether that subjective complexity was to do with the understanding of the system itself and how it may have consciousness of itself, as an organization, or are, subjective kind of complexity, relative to it. I was getting a little bit sort of lost there, but and also why I was
no, this is a good question. This is a good question. I don't think that it is right for us to answer this question yet, precisely because yes, there are points where it appears that that he endorses some sort of the functionalism that he has implicitly in mind endorses a consciousness of the systems, of objects, networks of objects, right? And their intercourses, right? And that would be something that STP, subset of practical, subset of theoretical practice, has been talked about in terms of objective phenomenology using Badiou's terminology. And this would be, but also this also has something to do, we can talk about it, network, Latour, and all of that stuff, right? But then I don't think that he wants to fully endorse this sort of what you might call to be objective phenomenology. In a sense that it might be appealing to some people, right? Because then if you approach the objective, the idea that object interaction between objects has its own consciousness in a certain sort of loose sort of way, then this creates a number of traditional philosophical problems down the line. I mean, any person who have read the critique of Latour or the actor network theory and this sort of stuff. And I know why some Marxists want to do this, precisely because within the traditional phenomenology of the systems, right, there is always the role of the subject as a human, right? Agency, right? But then this also brings it back to the idea that, so that how, for example, Karatani wants to extract these modes of exchange as kind of primitive generators for various behaviors of the structure of the world history. This always happens through the mind of an individual thinker, a philosopher, a historian, so on and so forth, right? And then it puts back the centrality within a thinker subject, right? And of course, for Marxists, that would be a sham. They want to say that, no, we have to go back to the material basis of the subject itself again. Hence, going toward this understanding that, the interaction between objects, we are all objects in the network, right? Even as it's the interaction between objects that makes this sort of consciousness and stuff. But then, as I said, this creates also its own problems, which any person who has read, critiques of Latour and actor network theory knows that this sort of dilution of agency in the realm of objects has its own bottlenecks, and are quite severe if you are not careful with that. But on the other side, yes, of course, this understanding that it's only a thinker subject, a philosopher, a historian, an anthropologist, an economist, so on and so forth, can create, by following the method of reduction and epoche, reduction and suspension of natural attitudes and philosophical attitudes, can reach toward these modes of exchange as transcendental social forms. That also is a little bit topsy-turvy, because what does guarantee this, right? So I think that this, as I said, this probably is not something that yet we can answer. There should be something in between, really, right? Because both of these scenarios can backfire in terms of if we really take them to the ultimate conclusions. So the idea of, describing the structure of world history can only be done by philosopher subjects or humanities subjects, thinkers. And the other one, well, it's just relation between objects. And objects here are, political organization collectively understood. That also doesn't work really.
Thank you.
My apologies. 1 second. I will come back. I just need to get my inhaler. I will come back and take the other questions. My apologies. My apologies. So next question.
Hi, everyone. I was
Hello.
particularly wondering about like desire from the capitalist perspective, and just thinking about how like desire kind of like enables capitalism to function the way it does. So I was wondering, when these alternative or anarchist structures emerge, like does desire kind of become incoherent? Because he kind of like talks about if we are to adopt mode D, that would like mode D would function if we can find a way to kind of like transcend desire and will. But I just felt like he was kind of like vague about it, about that. So I'm just kind of curious about like, what does transcending desire kind of look like?
Okay, so I mean, obviously, capitalism is probably the best, most insidious system for hijacking desires. Everyone knows that, right? It is essentially a system for reformatting human desires, right? And this is quite fundamental, precisely because then if it reformats desires, then it reformats imagination, right? Given the fact that imagination in Karatani's work is of utmost importance here. We should be very careful about what capitalism can do. Remember that Karatani associates with, he associates nation or community as such, right? Or mini systems with imagination. Capital with understanding, right? And a state with sensibility, right? Sorry, understanding with the state and, sorry, sensibility with capital. Sorry, my apologies. So imagination in Kant, and this is what Karatani's talk about, is essentially performs a synthetic function between understanding and sensibility, right? And hence nation as community, and community is where desire is in its kind of strongest form, right? Nation or community synthesizes between a state and capital. But when, and the whole point that these modes A, B, and C are concomitant, are coexisting, and they, in different sort of historical epochs, there are residues, but in the world empire, in the nation-state capital or full system of capitalism, it's the capital that is the most dominant expression of all these three modes. And this is where basically sensibility always has something to do with desire, right? In the canon of psychoanalysis or psychology or philosophy, it's precisely because of its attachment with the sensibility, capitalism, with the kind of material basis, it is capable of reformatting imagination, of how we can actually take a stand against capitalism itself. So imagine that our attitudes toward capitalism are being dictated by capitalism itself from the get-go. It's essentially a social engineering, socioeconomic engineering of desire. And by extension, imagination, imagining how capitalism can be changed, how a state can be changed. So we are in a kind of a double dilemma here, right? And of course, Karatani doesn't really have a good answer for this, precisely because, as you notice, the mode D is actually, which is probably the most important mode, right, is being vaguely articulated. One thing is that mode D does not try to. So mode D is what you might call to be essentially to going back to mode A, reciprocity, pure reciprocity, right, on a higher level, which means that, yes, you brought the idea of anarchism. So it means from a perspective, I mean, Karatani maybe not talked about this, or I haven't seen other people have talked about. This requires a certain sort of anarchistic standpoint, right? But not sort of anarchism that, just devolves into what you might call to be communalism or communitarian sort of anarchism. But it would be a form of anarcho-communism in the sense that you have to go back to a form of reciprocity, right? Through this mode D, through reorganizing the associations, reorganizing the community. Because reorganizing the community is a form of experimentation, right? The only thing that can rescue desire from the clutches of capitalism is reorganizations of the nodes of how individuals are connected with one another, reciprocity, right? But then this cannot be simply a kind of nostalgic return back to the, agrarian society or, uh, nomadic society, that sort of stuff, right? Because we know that those sort of nostalgic returns to nomadism, to earlier beautiful epochs where reciprocity was freer, in our time results in far more despotic forms of exploitation. I mean, that would be, people have talked about this from Wittfogel to other people, that, I mean, one of the understanding of the Asian despotism is essentially, in a sense, have been trying to resurrect mode A, but within, but by leaving the configuration of mode A, B, C intact. The point here, what Karatani wants to suggest, is that no, it's not merely a nostalgic return or relapse to mode A, but really reinventing mode A given our situation, given the present, here and now, under capitalism, on a different level. So it requires a process of sublation and reconfiguration. And of course, what reconfiguration does it mean, or reorganization of, a community or communitarian nodes means at this point, given the fact that desires have already been hijacked, given the fact that experience as such, right? And this is coming back to your point, that experience of individuals are utterly being loaded with capitalist agendas implicitly, even without them knowing that, right? So obviously Karatani wants to bring the mode D and its, its actualization, which would be X, communism, or as a kind of in tandem with world religions, as this sort of regulative idea, which crystallizes the very idea of impersonal emancipation as opposed to personal freedom. So you see personal freedom, any sort of understanding of personal freedom within the capitalist society, no matter how well adjusted it is, no matter how benevolent and conscious of its own status it is always bound to be a blind spot by the virtue of it being formatted, right? So, and this means a lot in the sense that, the attitudes that we take toward capitalism, whether in the woke culture, leftist culture, right-wing culture, these are essentially slices of capitalism itself interacting with itself, right? It's nothing other than that. Capitalism is interacting with itself through us in that sense of a specific individuality and individual desires, our experiences, right? So emancipation cannot simply be done at this point by aggregates, in a kind of democratic aggregates or aggregationalism of individual experiences, of our sufferings, our victimhood, so on and so forth. For this to happen, there needs to be a transition from personal emancipation or the illusion of personal emancipation to an impersonal emancipation, because only the system that can afford an impersonal or regulative idea that can afford impersonal emancipation can maximize individual freedom. outside of the system of capitalism. Otherwise, anything else would be just, you would be in the positive feedback loop of capitalism, nothing more, nothing less. So yes, so this understanding that what does it mean to transcend from one's experience and desires to something that is impersonal experience, and how to get there, that is the problem. That is the main thing that we have to talk about. Like, for example, a great example of this that I want to talk about, and has been mentioned a number of times by a lot of people. This idea of equality, fraternity, freedom, which is the slogan of French Enlightenment, right? And has been used usually to colonize people, right? Fraternity, equality, freedom. That would be just like a 101 European Enlightenment. In the name of fraternity, let's go and plunder the rest of the globe. So with this, you might say that, well, then we should put the idea of enlightenment completely outside, even French Enlightenment. And by the way, French Enlightenment is not really enlightenment, but let's talk about French Enlightenment here. So let's get rid of the French Enlightenment, given the fact that under its name, colonialism and most, rabid crimes have been committed. But then there are some people who would be able to, as I said, to move from personal to impersonal, to transplant ideas from one world to another world and work with them, right? And that requires, first and foremost, for them to have already figured out collectively how they can create a community among themselves, given who they are in their particularity and in connection with the universal. So famous example, French people, French soldiers, the Grand Army, they will be sent to Haiti at the onset of the Haitian Revolution. When they hear, the French soldiers hear that the Haitian soldiers, who are all Black, and they have created one of the most magnificent revolutions by Black representatives and confederalism of Black people against the full force of French colonialism. They have created that sort of revolution, and then they hear that these Haitian soldiers are shouting in French the slogan of the French Enlightenment: equality, fraternity, and freedom. And they think that they are on the wrong side. They don't realize that these are different sort of people. You see, because they managed to transplant something that in that context of community in French was toxic, to transplant it within their own organization and their own organization of community, to turn it into a different sort. Instead of being the apparatus of individualistic freedom, it becomes now an apparatus of a collective freedom in the Haitian Revolution. So there are all these stories can be talked about, how we make community at this point, how in order to move from the individual freedom to collective and impersonal freedom, from personal experiences to impersonal experiences, such that something that couldn't be done simply by resorting to the aggregates of personal experiences can be done by resorting to our impersonal experiences that binds us in a different context that is given to us. And that brings, of course, a lot about collective memory, right? Because usually people who are part of a community, they have a collective memory. They are deep objects. They cannot be simply reproduced. Do you think that, people of North Africa can simply be, or MENA people, people have been talked about this, MENA people. And of course, there are many, many examples, but I'm just saying this because I do belong to the MENA people, meaning that Middle East and North African people, right? The MENA people have a strange way of creating community among themselves as a resistant to colonialist, infringements by tapping into their collective memory, by shifting the nodes of reciprocity, by creating new communities, and hence creating new enemies and friends. Ryan,
Yeah, hello
and thank you
everyone.
so much, by the way, Keke. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, my question, I think you addressed a good amount of my question, but I had a simpler question about methodology in Karatani's. I mean, he explains at the end of the introduction that he's trying to undergo a transcendental critique of the relationships between the modes of exchange. And so my first question is simply, I question where these modes of exchange come from, especially when, as he's positing this mode D, which in some sense to me seems strange that that is given an entirely categorical, a separate mode when, especially in the mode B, plunder and redistribution, he talks about this sort of like, B1, B2, B3. And I'm confused, I guess, on where exactly these modes come from and how to kind of um, address their usefulness in approaching world history, especially since he talks about that the distinctions are not based on scale or size, but this sort of the boundary of the community is that essential way in which he talks about these different modes interacting. And so yeah, that's my first part of the question, simply about the methodology and where these modes come from. And then second of all, if the boundary of the community is that essential line of which how we describe modes of exchange in a capitalist system in which this sort of deterritorializing of communities themselves is, one of the a primary characteristic. How can we approach? How can we use this methodology cleanly when those lines of community are so thoroughly and quickly?
Methodology of arriving at mode of exchange, at the transcendental reduction of mode of exchange.
Correct, especially when, to me, if I may be misunderstanding, but the mode of exchange, it's the exchange between communities. And
Yes.
so that line is necessary of applying this sort of lens.
Yes, yes. By the way, it's good to have you here. So many
Good to
years.
see you.
Yes, mode D, I mean, I will recommend for the next session, which we are reading, the one on anarcho-communism and the Kolmogorov complexity. You can, as a supplementary text, I mean, it's kind of long text, but you can just like read through the first 10 pages of it. It's called The Atlas of Experimental Politics by the collective called Subset of Theoretical Practice. The essay is actually was published by Shum magazine, Shum journal. It's quite good, and Gabriel Tupinamba and Jean-Pierre Caron and Yuan Diao, and many people are there as part of this collective, and they in fact talk about this. But I'm not convinced the way that they go on and try to simply drop the mode D. I don't think that is actually, and of course I will, as we move forward, I will say why I think that it's problematic. They precisely because of what you said here, they say, okay, let's just forget about mode D. It doesn't belong here, right? It's kind of like an afterthought that what's the title? The title is Atlas of Experimental Politics, written by the collective Subset of Theoretical Practice. So they say, well, it doesn't belong here precisely because, of course, I understand why they say this, because I'm Marxists. I'm not Marxist. They don't want universal religion there. Just like it sounds a little bit fishy to them. Right. Not only that, but also because when you are talking about universal religion, you are talking about ideology. Right. And of course, we have talked about, of course, Karatani is not talking about protagonist ideology or ideology given or proposed or advanced by a few elites, but an ideology that is essentially part of a process, right, of collective organization, of the will of the people, so to speak. So mode D, they realize it, that mode D essentially what you might call to be a mode that has always been in the background of the structuration of world history. Not the structure of the world history, but the structuration of world history. People have different names for it at different times. Sometimes it would be Judaism. Sometimes it's Christianity. Sometimes it's called Islam. Sometimes it's called communism as a process. Remember, in German ideology, when Marx and Engels says that communism is not the achieved totality of affairs, it's not in fact a thing. It's not a state of affairs that can be achieved or completed. Yeah, it does not represent the totality of history. It is essentially what you might call to be a trajectory, a process that is whose aim is to abolish any illusion, whether cognitively or concretely or historically, illusion of achievement of a complete totality of history. Namely, the complete totality of history when we are talking about, we are obviously talking about capitalism, right? So communism, in that sense, is essentially that sort of process. And that he doesn't want to talk about it as communism. Hence, he says a mode D substantiation or actualization can be called X precisely because it's a template, a placeholder that at different times it can be called different names. But nevertheless, it has something to do with the sublative movement, sublative movement of universal, world historical, universal religions, right? And in a sense that it is comprised of two, what you might call to be vectors, so to speak. One, going forward, which is the latter arrow of it, and the former arrow of it, the most important of it, is that it goes backward, not backward literally, but backward, it comes from the back. but it always to us appears that it goes backward. But in reality, it is coming always from the past within a community that we understand, that we grasp it as if this is how the past speaks to us. Hence, it is fundamentally the movement of history itself. So you see, you can't have, in fact, the mode A, B, C, I would say, without mode D, because mode D is really the return of the repressed, the return of the past in the present, such that it ignites the motivation of presence toward a different world, a different future. Right? So while it is not part of the generative grammar of the nation state capital, it is what makes the structural world history to begin with. Because there is something fundamental within it in terms of how the effects of the past are being realized in the present such that they can echo in the future concretely.
Got it. Thank you.
Is it Matvey?
Yeah. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Reza, I think you kind of address the majority of my question addressed in the last 5 minutes. So I'm really happy. I'm not gonna spend too much time on asking it once again. But I still wanted to maybe clarify one part, particularly maybe getting inspired or by the question about desire. My trouble with mode D is that I try to understand whether Karatani kind of takes it as a culmination of a form, like of the movement of liberation, or maybe as a finite entity or as a finite structure, or it kind of presents a new form of creative association. Because I'm not sure if it has any deeper connection with the world systems that he discusses, and whether it's like a final system, like final vital system that is ever changing, or it's kind of a more conserved state that allows us to move in this very steady directions that you also kind of
It's not a
talked
state,
about.
though. It's not a state. It's a
It's not a state.
tendency. It's a
Tendency,
tendency.
okay.
A tendency.
Okay. Then, and again, I think that, was that you already clarified it in one way or another. But I was wondering, you said interpersonal experience that we need to
My
kind of,
apologies. Someone is at the door. I will, 1 second.
okay.
My apologies. My sincere apologies. 1 second. My sincere apologies.
Yeah, no, I mean, just quickly to finish my long question, I think my question is about desire, and whether in this phase of, or in this kind of mode of interpersonal experience that as a community we need to reach, does that mean that there's a sort of an end to the notion of desire that was guiding a formation of, let's say, any of the other modes of existence?
Yeah, you see, think about this. What Niam was mentioning in terms of the interaction between systems and their environments, right? It's a problem of complexity, right? It's a problem of interaction, and of course, navigation and perspective and representation, and all of that sort of stuff that, people have been always talking about, and mediation. You see, think about, let's just go, as I said, let's not do this because it's very too Latourian, but no, actually, let's do this. But in terms of system theory, right, and complexity theory, when we are talking about interpersonal relationships, we have a very, very rudimentary account of what it might be. And then we always try to reinterpret the interpersonal relationships filtered through our personal experiences, That always creates frustration for everyone involved, right? Because we haven't managed to achieve a certain sort of descriptive vocabularies, even descriptive vocabularies. Let's not even talk about prescription or explanation at this point. A descriptive vocabulary is that to tell us what we are doing exactly when we are engaging in interpersonal relationships, reciprocities of various forms, intercourses of various forms. You see, when two systems or multiple systems, like a multi-system account, so a multi-system interaction, just thinks about a server and client in computer science, right? Server-client relationship. There are different sort of system, servers and clients are working with another. And then these servers and clients also have a kind of an ambient system within which they work, and that's called their environment, right? It's not environment per se, it's their environment. It's a context of the operation, of the interaction between server and the client computers, right, or systems. Within this, systems don't exactly have access to the full environment, even in that sort of parochial sense that I mentioned, meaning that their environment, they don't have full access to that. They have slices, according to their perspective, they have slices of what this environment might be, right? Think about this. When we are, this is also, Gabriel Tupinamba, one of his lectures, which was magnificent. I watched, recently. He was talking about the dynamics of a class, right? Like between me and you and other students. Why is that some people never talk? Well, we don't know. Is it because that there is a basis here that is fundamentally stifling, that it canalizes interactions toward a certain sort of category? Or is it because they are shy, or they are feeling ill-equipped, or they want to be patient and then release information? So you see, within this sort of conglomeration or configuration or composition, interpersonal relationship or reciprocity is always constrained by the very fact of interaction itself. Not only interaction among the members or the system, server and clients, but also their ultimate interaction with their explicit environment, but also what is implicitly there and they cannot access it. Each of them have different sort of perspectives, right? Different sorts of access to what they see as a relationship, as an intercourse, right? So this is obviously not really an interpersonal relationship in the mode D. It is interpersonal relationship in the sense that we are always already embedded within the triad of nation, state, and capital. So Karatani cannot even pretend that he can achieve a pure categories. This is not, in fact, what he wants to achieve, that some pure categories. These are transcendental categories. Transcendental meaning that they have been deduced or reduced abductively through the situatedness of us here and now, by how we perform and experiment in interpersonal relationships and reciprocities, that these hypothetically might be the primitive generatives to generate the grammar of the structuration of world history. It is not as if there are, by any means, I would say, there are literally the most fundamental particles there are, right? There is. There are literally hypotheticals that can be achieved given our situatedness, because you can't get out of the situatedness here. Now, he wants to do this. In fact, this is kind of a system engineering thought, that he wants to, by way of the methodological reduction, he wants to achieve some transcendental social forms, right? And some primitives, generators for them. And these can only be done not in abstract, in thin air, but given how we are entangled within the triad of nation, state, capital. No beautiful souls here, right? So he wants to say that, okay, let's achieve these so-called hypotheticals, modes of exchange, and then try to rethink about the structure of the world history in the sense of the plural, structures of world's histories. Like there might be different sort of structures. There might be different histories that we have only navigated this one. We have only navigated this one, and we cannot simply say that, well, you know, I can entertain another one. No, he wants, as a Marxist, he wants to say that this is a material basis of any sort of contemplation that we are going to have, thinking about the possibility of other worlds, right? So from this point, given these primitive generators, let's think about how, if we change the configurations of reciprocities through experimentation, and this experimentation meaning that changing our attitude toward political organizations, collective political organization, right? And hence community. If we do that, then would it be possible to change the context of these interpersonal relationships? Change the context of these perspectives. Something that might be capitalist or colonialist in one context might be, as I said in the Haitian Revolution example, might be a fundamentally emancipatory in another context. And that's his point, that mode D is essentially a tendency toward this reconfiguration of compositions that are given to us. And of course, these compositions are within the triad of nation, state, capital.
And just to clarify, this tendency does not have a certain determinate end to itself.
No, as I said, communism is not an achieved totality of history. Achieved totality of history's name for it is essentially capitalism, because it is only capitalism that that essentially tries to emulate the semblance of an achieved totality of history. And this is by ultimate, as we have seen it today, is by creating its own epistemological apparatus to show that capitalism is nothing but nature too, nature fully understood. You see, the capitalism, this is, and lands, I think, is extremely cogent and dangerous, particularly on this front, precisely because for land, capitalism is nothing but the second nature, except that the second nature is not culture in the old sense. It's nature fully made explicit, right? Capitalism wants to naturalize itself because naturalization of a phenomenon, of a world historical phenomenon, would be tantamount to the totalization of world history. Hence, for Marx and Engels, it's the illusion, the ultimate illusion of history.
Thank you, Reza.
Absolutely. Costa, and then after Costa's, we go for a break, and then I will start. But I think it's good that we kind of move through Karatani, so I don't need to explain too much about Karatani, and then get going with the organization complexity stuff. Costa, please.
Okay. Thank you, Reza. So
Absolutely.
I actually had a question about the Bennett reading a little bit, and kind of on the idea of logical depth, the slow growth law, and sort of what makes an object deep. So I kind of had a maybe weird example, maybe kind of I'm going off on the wrong track here, but of I was basically watching Pirates of the Caribbean with my friends over the weekend, and my friend made a observation that kind of, shows the kinds of friends I have about a particular hinge that was used in the construction of a prison door. And basically, he's pointing out an anachronistic element of the film where, you see that it was not a mass-produced hinge. It was like before the area of industrialization, so it was created by a blacksmith. And so I was kind of thinking, if you were to see this hinge by itself on a desert island, it wouldn't be.
Sorry, if you see what?
If you were to find this hinge, let's say on a desert island, you would have no context for it. It would appear to have like a very long developmental history. And I would wonder if that developmental history is enough to consider it deep, or if I'm going off on a tangent, because it is, you can imply like the existence of, let's say, the British colonial empire. This was like a British prison fort. You can imply the relationship between, like, let's say, the blacksmith who made the hinge, all the social labor relations and everything. So if you were to, let's say, find this hinge and go back on its the history of interactions that have produced it, would that be enough to sort of, let's say, situate it in a fixed context and sort of give it the kind of depth?
No, you are completely accurate. I think, have you read? I think, is it Bennett or Paul Vitanier who actually make example of what is this? A beer can or soda, the one that you pull it. What is it called in English? The tab, the pull.
Yeah, the tab, yes.
The tab. So just a tab, seeing it somewhere, right? Completely in the desert island. That is a deep object.
Okay.
And Bennett says, someone asks him that Alhambra, the palace, is it a deep object? It says, no, the beer pull tab is actually a deep object. Alhambra might not be a deep object. Because there is something quite specific about a deep object, right? As he talks about it. It is a form of precisely because a deep object on the facade looks inconsequential and deceivingly looks simple. But by association, right, by its developmental association, it is an index of a massive amount of computational cost, memory, computational memory, and computational time, runtime, a slow time, right? And of course, if you see a cans tab just by itself, this is what you might call to be a kind of a cipher, so to speak, a message in the bottle, as Paul Vitanier talks about it, and I will read the quotes, that is suggestive of an extremely advanced civilization, except that the advancement of this civilization is being compressed so vastly and so over, because you see, this sort of compression cannot be done in low thresholds of computational time, right? It can only have massive amounts of time for this to arise. So hence it is compressed, it's encapsulated, like a message in the bottle. And for you, and this is a duality. Whenever we talk about a deep object in this sense, we are talking about duality. Not only the time, computational time and cost took for this object to be actualized, to be effectuated, to be realized, but also the amount of time that it takes from this simple cantab, we can deduce the advancement of the civilizations that have created it, right? So this is the gist of a deep object.
Yeah. Okay. That was excellent. Thank you. And I also just wanted to add on to that. Is it then, I guess, would it be sort of a worthwhile methodology to look into sort of how similar objects that may have may appear kind of, let's say, almost like weird technical objects, like pieces of hardware, pieces of technology or something, to sort of see the history of interactions that produced it and try to sort of like, I guess, gauge the complexity or the maturity, let's say, of an institution and the
Yes,
various layers of it.
absolutely, and of course, absolutely. I mean, um, you know, one of the things, of course, I will talk about this more at length. Please, someone reminds me to pick up this line and thread later on. Maybe not this session, another session. This idea, Ryan was also talking about, you know, how did he arrive at these modes of exchange, right? You know, and, you know, well, you know, you can arrive at the mode of exchange A, let's say that, you know, because it's kind of easy to, from a historical perspective, to arrive at mode A, right? The agrarian society, nomadic, and this and that. But how did it actually arrive at this, given the fact that before it would be hunter-gatherers, that they don't have any sort of trace of these modes of exchange, right? So it's obviously, you know, Mackenzie work in general intellect, and I generally don't, lot of topics I don't agree with Mackenzie work, but I think that this is a very neat sort of critique that they levy against Karatani. That lo and behold, well, you know, Karatani doesn't actually consider the fact that these modes, A, B, and C, not D, A, B, and C, have something to do with a metabolic rift in terms of labor and in terms of how technology allows us to overcome the metabolic rifts, right? From hunter-gatherer, pseudo communities to agrarian farming society, there should be obviously the reason that they settled and they created this mode A is because of climate change. Climate change is an index of metabolic rift. And for you to be able to resolve the metabolic rift and effectuate mode A, you need to have a deep object, a technological apparatus, a technique that will furrow, right? Or any sort of primitive farming tool. That's a deep object. It's almost alien in its nature, given the consequences that it unleashes throughout the history. JP has joined, so I'm not going to talk about that much about STP now. So let's have a 10 minutes break, and then I will come and I will read to whatever amount that I can do. As I said, this session and the second session are part of the same sort of things, complexity and organization. And then we move forward with Rodrigo Nunes and as I said, maybe next session we can also read the first 10 pages of the Atlas of Experimental Politics in tandem with the one on anarcho-communism by my friend Mathilde Marcoli, was written this under a pen name. And the last one would be on hegemony, and then that would be kind of like, again, extension of Nunes' neither vertical nor horizontal work. And okay, so let's have a break for 10 minutes.
Reza, just one doubt. This critique of Mackenzie, on Karatani, it's on molecular red or it's
General
it's from-
intellect, general
general
intellect.
intellect. Okay, thank you.
General intellect, absolutely, absolutely. Any questions before we start the session? Nia, please.
Hi, Reza. Do you think that in Karatani's critique of Marx and the mode of production, going back to this, what we were talking about, where it's sort of tied to the personal and the subject, this kind of vertical axis adhering to the person, so where there's a kind of a question of freedom and alienation, and exploitation, and then some kind of voluntary sort of servitude in a way kind of comes about within this idea of, kind of a false consciousness. And that there's some kind of way in that he's trying to rethink that vertical, and that does it become diagonal? Am I kind of,
Depth-wise, he wants to think about it depth-wise,
but
right?
in a sense, not tied to mode of production, and that it's instead that it is going towards what you're also talking about, the impersonal. It's not tying to the person and the subject, and that kind of substantialist, reductionist, kind of essentialist kind of way. And that there's also kind of meaning and reference for, the understanding of the, trying to gain freedom and understand what has been kind of lost, under kind of capitalism. So he's trying to take that vertical, and does he diagonalize it with this mode of exchange?
Yeah. No, absolutely. That is exactly what he wants to do. But as I said, I think that there is something that you see. This is my problem with Mackenzie work. Unfortunately, Mackenzie work is super smart, bright, but they don't go and fully explicate this beyond just a smart insights. I think that when maybe she doesn't articulate this, maybe she already had this in mind. This is actually quite very interesting that work points to this. That in the mode of exchange, yeah, sure, absolutely. That is what Karatani tries to do, and it's quite interesting. Diagonalizing the vertical, right? And kind of precisely because this allows us for two things. It allows us, when we do that, when we decompose the vertical into the diagonal, or the depth-wise and diagonal, because they're coming always entangled. Depth-wise and diagonal are entangled here. When we think about organization as a complexity, what Karatani tries to do is that he wants to create a platform for cognitive and political reorganization, right? Away from some of the quagmires of the Marxian thought, right? Obviously, shift to the mode of exchange allows us to be capable of coming with better descriptive vocabularies as what the structure of world history is and what might it look like, and what it has been. By the virtue of what you already said, by the virtue that this diagonalization is based on a certain sort of functionalist structuralism. The descriptive vocabularies are not just theoretical. The descriptive vocabularies that are implicit within Karatani and Karatani's projects are fruits of precisely the functionalist, structuralist kernel of his project, in the sense that once you move from modes of production to the mode of exchange, things becomes about more concretely and cognitively about interactions, about intercourses, right? About the situatedness of actors within a network, within the environment, with regard to other systems, And this brings ideas like blind spots of the systems, about symmetries of organization, symmetry breakings, asymmetries, concurrencies, diachronicities, and things that usually regular Marxist modes of production discourse doesn't not allow us by any means to talk about, right? Because this is, as we have
And is
seen
it because we're caught with those Marxists are caught in the kind of dialectic of the reproduction of the totality as well? Because, and maybe where you're starting to bring in the idea of the possibility of reconfiguration around, the intercourse and the interactions, because the dialectic of the subject, and in this kind of Marxist verticality is tied to the reproduction of the totality,
Yes,
and
yes,
then where you're
absolutely.
talking
And
about
within the totality,
the entropic nature of the totality, because it is impossible, of course, so that is the dialectic, isn't it? That it can't be achieved, it won't be arrived at, but this is where we're navigating. We're being kind of guided towards that.
yes, and think about this also within the structure of totality. What does you see within the structure of totality? Or achieved, the illusion of achieved totality, right? The illusion of achieved totality or completed totality, totalization, totalized state of affairs. What you always get is, and it of course shows in a kind of a canon of the Marxian tradition, you get the bipolarity between theory and praxis, right? So you either get a theory or practice, or the rift between the two, right? But if you dissolve the totality, if you, through that, shift from the modes of production to the mode of exchange, right? What you get would be a synthetic mediator between the two, right? Between theory and practice. That would be organization. And organization precisely in the sense of always already being situated within various forms of intercourses, right? Social forms of intercourses, right? Now, this, however, brings back to what I was trying to say with regard to work, that I think that work is onto something. Should have written a whole book on this instead of just like doing worky stuff. This idea that she puts forward that even within the mode of exchange, A, B, C, right? There is a form of an implicit form of work and production. Not in a Marxian sense, but in relation with so-called totality of the environment, of the system, right? As I mentioned, I was talking to the last one. It was Costa or Ryan or Matthew, or Eduardo, all of them, I think, that there is that. Look, how does mode A actually come into being, right? Concretely, on the basis of material basis, right? How does it come into being? Well, of course, Karatani says that, well, he arrives at it through a certain sort of transcendental reduction, and then STP, of course, Jean-Pierre, we should, Clarisse, would you be able to let Jean-Pierre and Ilya in?
Yes, yes, yes. Yeah.
And then STP, this precisely because of this, wants to say that, well, no, this sort of transcendental reduction as I said, it has that sort of connotation of that this procedure is something that can only be done within the ambit of a thinker subject, right? A thinker, right? A philosopher, an intellectual, so on and so forth. But the real proper what you might be zone of expression for this reduction is actually political experimentation, collective political organization, right? But even that doesn't really answer how does really genuinely mode A being substantiated in farming societies, in agrarian society. Well, because there are other sort of material bases here, which I think Mackenzie work is completely right. Climate change. And the fact that these earlier societies try to adapt to precisely a new situation, a new material situation. They have to settle precisely because of the scarcity of food. Nomadism, in fact, becomes more and more, if we read Wittfogel and the whole, history of nomadism in Arabian Peninsula and stuff, the history of nomadism actually shows this quite even more emphatically than simply change from hunter-gatherer to agrarian society, to farming society. We see that in the history of nomadism, through change in the environment, in the climate, right, is being forced. And then change with the climate also means that it changed precisely because it's a material basis, certain sort of change in the state or nation configurations as the time passes, right? We see that they, for example, the nomads roam on massive expanses, but then nomadism becomes merely just moving between a number of pre-specified points. Only for them, given the scarcity of food and scarcity of and the hardship of the survival, they have to do this, right? And then, obviously, in response to this problem of scarcity, in this problem of dealing with some of the most brutal, materials bases, which are dictated by the planet itself here, the Earth, and its climate, they have to invent technologies which Karatani thinks that, it might not be that important, because he says something that, for example, he says that, that the most that the real technological innovations didn't actually kick in until the what you might call to be the realization of a kind of like a state, right? It means probably Babylonian, Sumerians, and Greek, and that sort of stuff, Ionians. But no, before that, as I said, I mean, what would be a better counterexample to this as technical innovations in response to the constraints of the material basis, hence climate change, which was absolutely responsible for the evolution of the, or the emergence of mode A, than, the invention of furrow or furrowing practices. Without that, there would be no such a thing as mode A. And by definition, mode A, mode B. Maybe before I start, Jean-Pierre wants to also say something in response to what you asked, because Jean-Pierre is far more knee-deep in Karatani than me. As I said, I'm merely trying to use Karatani as an excuse to talk about something that I think is important. It is not the central, concern of me.
What was the question again, Reza?
Neil,
The question was, I was just asking about, if Karatani, critiquing Marx's mode of production and the kind of vertical axis there tied to the mode of production, we were talking about earlier on about kind of adhering to the person or the subject, and that the value of freedom under, exploitation under capital, and the whole kind of the narrative around false consciousness and of kind of voluntary servitude, and his kind of reduction to a kind of essentialism of the human there, and this kind of substantialism, and that by shifting to the mode of exchange, that Karatani is
In Karatani,
diagonalizing.
you mean there's like an essentialism in Karatani?
No, that he's saying that
No,
there is in
okay.
Marx. Yeah.
Oh,
And
there
that
is
he's,
Marx. Okay.
yeah, and that he's shifting to the mode of exchange, and that I was also bringing in this kind of thing of the dialectic of the mode of production, and the reproduction of the system, of capital, because we were kind of talking about, the totality, and the under capitalism, and we were also talking about this. I was introducing this idea then of the reproduction of the totality, where under the mode of exchange, it brings in this possibility for reconfiguration around forms of interaction, and intercourse, and that's something very different in a way of thinking about the dialectic of reproduction of the totality,
Yeah. I mean, the way we worked, I mean, it's not that Reza told that Karatani is not at the center of his concerns. Neither of my concerns. But at the time of the writing of the Atlas, of course, Karatani was central. I was part of the STP, as Eduard is here. She was also part of the STP. Not sure if at the same time, at that time precisely. But anyway, and what that entailed was, I mean, the approach, the wager was that gave us a more fine-grained analysis of a totality in terms of the combination of different modes of intercourse. So you could read, the conjuncture, let us say, the mode of production in terms of the coexistence of modes A, B, and C, and in different degrees and in different recipes, specific recipes. So that gave us the idea of a different kind of theory of transition, in a sense. So instead of the kind of usual Leninist, for instance, narrative of transition, through basically through the hijacking of mode B of the state and stuff like that. You see, we could try and visit. And Reza's, I think Reza's reading is perfect. It gave us a vocabulary that kind of enables us to think of different forms of transition and organization. And that was basically the gambit at the time when we were using Karatani. So I think you are correct. Of course, it's you could think of that as a kind of a diagonalization par regard to the Marxian narrative, in a sense, because it's kind of reconstructing these totality out of these different kind of logics, what we called in the STP different logics of exchange. So also the different modes were also associated with different logics, like mode A with a paraconsistent logic, because at the border you have something that is and isn't at the same time, and at the border between one community and the next. And mode B was associated with classical logic, because the logic of the state is also always like trying to define the terms, such as for instance, in contracts, in juridical terms, you have to kind of define the terms so as to ban any kind of ambiguity. So either is or is not. And the logic of value, which is mode C, which is kind of intuitionistic logic because it accepts gradients. So you have not two values, but all the gradients between two values. So this is kind of this flexible, this kind of infinite kind of valued logic, which is mode C. And this enabled us to think of different recipes, different communities as being like recipes where you have a dominant mode and things like that. There's a different kind of analysis that is enabled by that. Another interesting thing is about this thing about the subject and theory and praxis. I really like what Reza was saying. This was not necessarily a point of agreement between everybody in the group because, in fact, Karatani, yes, is justifying the assumption of the modes in terms of Husserlian kind of transcendental reduction. So he's basically studying and looking from a kind of contemplative point of view of a philosopher, the different modes throughout history and trying to reduce them to these different elements, like in a kind of analogous way as Husserl would do it. And the SCP was saying that no, what does this job is actual political organization in the sense that the political organization has a specific sensitivity. So if you have a bank, of course, you are sensitive to the movements in mode C and to the movements in mode B, and maybe less sensitive in mode A. Different forms of organization are sensitive to different forms of logic. And you could test out and map out the landscape through the kind of adjudication of the specific sensitivities of the organizations in place. But then what I mean that we're not necessarily in agreement is that I was always also valuing a little bit more the place of cognitive abstraction, because I don't think it's just political organization per se, but it's political organization as seen through the lenses of conceptual rationality that is able to give us these results. It's not just organizing and that goes by itself. So this was an internal debate within the group. This is what I
cognitive navigation.
Cognitive navigation, exactly. And this was an important point that was not necessarily embraced by all the group. They really didn't want any truck with the subject or the.
That is magnificent. Yeah, that's because when you came a little bit late, but if you watch the session, I mean, we talked about this, and I said, yeah, I mean, one of the things that I noticed that there is a shift from a transcendental phenomenology to what they call objective phenomenology, right? And I said, yeah. So, without further ado, let's start. Thank you so much, Jean-Pierre. I mean, are you going to come back next session?
Yes. I hope so.
Okay.
Yeah.
No pressure, but anytime it would be magnificent.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Not going to bother you.
Okay. It's my pleasure.
My pleasure. I'm humbled. So let's start. We're, of course, late, but I'm going to start. So I think that with some introductory remarks. One, I want to talk about history, phenomenology, and then structure and organization. And this through a certain sort of, a kind of series of diagrams that I would be talking about, and then we can find what is missing among them, how we can integrate the insights, and so on and so forth. So just as I said, introduction to some of the stuff that I have been already talking about, in the past decade or so, with regard to idea of navigation, organization, phenomenology, and so on and so forth. So first, I want to say something that what we are talking about, when we are talking about, as I said, the phenomena today, organizations today, essentially all of this stuff that we are dealing with, right? And I don't think that we have even the problem is not, unfortunately, to creating a list of the obscenities that is going on in the world today, but rather where and when to stop the list, right? Such that we can actually do some thinking. Because if it is merely matter of obscenity, a stamp collection, the list can go on infinitely in this here and now of us. So thinking about phenomena such as capitalism, apartheid, human experience, interpersonal interactions, social media, anything that you might say as part of the historical dynamics that is unfolding, I think that as a philosopher, I would say that yes, there would be a good way to think about this for now. As I said, it's a part of the introduction, it's a stepping stone. It's not as if I'm set on this, that, oh, this is the only thing. No. But I think that it would be great to think about this in terms of phenomenology, and particularly I want to talk about this in terms of Husserlian phenomenology, because that's most I'm familiar with, right? In the sense that what is this phenomena that we are trying to describe, and how are they phenomena? By virtue of what they become phenomena, and what does it mean for them to be phenomena that we are interacting with, that we are having certain sort of experience of, and then in individually or collectively, and in response to that experience, we try to, individually or collectively come up with different ways of either altering our experience, altering the experience of others, or filtering certain sort of experiences or attitudes toward this phenomena in favor of other sort of attitudes that might be more fruitful for us to graduate from a merely personal experience and intercourse or interaction with this phenomena to a rather more impersonal, collective sort of, approach, perspective, and consciousness. So it is famous that for Husserl's transcendental phenomenology is this, literally, to be succinct, that phenomenon is nothing less than an intentional configuration in which the things themselves. Now, of course, you see, this is a very unorthodox reading of Husserl, because I want to say that whenever, right, I want to play a little bit of Ali Shariati here. Remember those people who take my seminar in the previous one, Ali Shariati had this word, Reza most probably remembers it. I think Niam also might remember this. So Ali Shariati had this famous prescription, given that he's kind of a closeted, he's not a closeted Marxist, it was a strategic Marxist trying to talk to Muslims, right? And he was saying that whenever you in Quran, you see the word God, replace it with the word people, the masses. And whenever you see the word people, Nas, replace it with the word Allah, God. I would say that, with Husserl, we can do the same thing. Whenever, of course, this is a very, just like what Shariati had done, it requires a massive sort of a stretch, but it is useful as a hypothetical abductive exercise to do this, to replace every time that we see the word things in themselves with the word or the phrase material basis, right? So phenomenon is nothing less than an intentional configuration in which the things themselves manifest themselves in the double sense of appearance and appearing, and thus as the manifestation of that which hides itself in that appearance. So phenomena is nothing less than an intentional configuration in which the things themselves manifest themselves to us in relation to the very manner in which we are present to them, right? The manner in which we are present to them. It is already what Husserl is talking about is about a situatedness for uncovering the things themselves as phenomena, right? That it is only by shifting our situatedness that we can create a horizon, construct a horizon through which the things in themselves manifest themselves progressively to us, right? And we become aware of them. So in this sense, the paradox of transcendental phenomenology is thus that the things themselves are phenomena which, and because they do not appear as such to the natural attitude of consciousness, the attitude by which consciousness is simply aware of that which is confronted or exposed to, and not yet the manner or modality, the condition or possibility by which the things themselves are present to consciousness as phenomena, require, in order to present themselves as they are. This is the work of transcendental phenomenology. However, and it's important to note that this decisive fact, since phenomena only appear as such through a phenomenological investigation, that is, by the application of a precise modality of logos apophanticus, and thus by actualization of phenomenological reduction and suspension, namely epoche, of the natural attitude of consciousness and experience, the very nature of and essence of phenomena is, at the outset, always happen to be fundamentally problematic. My apologies, 1 second, 1 second. My apologies. So what is this? Looks like a very philosophical sort of a statement that has nothing to do with what we are talking about here, but it actually has a lot to do with what we have been talking about. Particularly the last sentence, the very nature of and the essence of phenomena is at the outset problematic, right? In fact, thinking about, again, capitalism, about the interactions, any sort of interactions that in fact we have with one another, not only with the dominant systems under which we are functioning, but we also in terms of our interactions, our intercourses, various forms of intercourses. That this, by definition, at the outset, what appears to be the case is always, from a standpoint of phenomenology, is fundamentally problematic, right? Given the fact that it is positively and negatively constrained by how we are situated with regard to the phenomena, right? With that which tries to appear and in its own appearing tries to hide something, right? And that's the nature, of the things in themselves, translate to material basis, right? And how material bases are being organized into various sort of forms. And of course, we can now give a certain sort of a slant, a new slant to this phenomenological, transcendental phenomenological attitude, which, of course, I see that not only in STP, but in other number of other sort of what you might call to be works on organization 1 and organization 2, organization as complexity and organization as just like discipline of political organization have been talked about. I mean, one good example would be Alexander Bogdanov work on technology, right? The universal science of organization. So in that sense, we can give a new slant to the attitude of transcendental phenomenology, which would be the idea of organization and its facets, which can only be manifested by the manner in which we are present to them, by the manner in which we are present to an organization, that we can, uncover facets of organizations, to describe an organization, to intervene with it in any sort of consequential way, right? This bring back to the idea of a navigation, in a way that we take a position, we see, we intervene at, and we navigate a system, is exactly how we, disclose facets of the system. Coming back to what I said earlier on with regard to Renathon and the black box, so phenomenology in this sense can be understood, and of course there is quite a literature behind this. It's not just Husserlian. People who are familiar with the emergence of the complexity science at the turn of 20th century know that the phenomenology is tied at its core to the project of describing and charting out complexity as such, complex organizations, right? And how do you describe complex organizations? Through a phenomenological attitudes, by considering that we can only uncover facets of complexity by how we navigate them, by how we present ourselves to them, right? And then if we change the context of this presentation in the double sense, we can arrive at new scales of complexity of a given system. So I think we are running out of time. Maybe I should stop here. So this, before stopping, I want to say that, so this brings us to essentially the title of Karatani's work, right? The structure of world history. I want to somehow unravel this title backward. First, by looking at history, what, from Ferdinand Brodel, how historians have looked at history. What do we actually mean by history, right? And various ways that history has been, a sequence of historical events have been configured and composed and treated as structures, right? As historical structures or world histories. So that's number one. And then history, then a structure of world, right? Or worlds. What do we mean by structures here? Then obviously comes the idea of organization, complexity, and earlier on we were talking about functionalism, right? In that specific sense that Bennett is, for example, Paul Whitney is talking about. So this is something that I'm going to do next session by going over a number of diagrams. One first with history and how historians usually have tried to interpret descriptive narrative history, and this in contrast with how scientists have tried to, for example, interpret a sequence of historical events. And this also from the phenomenological perspective that I just mentioned. Then from this, we are moving toward the consequences of this phenomenological approach to history. We see that it naturally leads to an account of system and complexity, which is hierarchical, which is multi-scale, which is context sensitive and situated, right? And then from this, we will unfold it to a number of other sort of sets of concepts: interaction, composition, the STP concepts, and other sort of concepts like, essentially logical depth, memory, and so on and so forth. So this is how we are going to continue the rest of this seminar. Again, I'm sorry, but I think it was necessary for us just go over Karatani a little bit. Some of the main issues can be resolved. Still, there are many issues that have been unanswered. We will try to come back to them, but I think for now, we have at least with regard to Karatani, we have gone through the introduction, so it's now time to somehow deconstruct it by way of the modern understanding of complexity. And so, any questions before we close this session? Ryan.
Yeah, just in terms of if we miss your larger session on complexity, are there certain texts that you would raise above others in terms of providing a more essential structure of understanding organization as we're
Yes.
talking about it via complexity?
Yes. But these are, the good texts about complexity always are mixed with technical stuff. There is another work by Charles Bennett, 1996, I think. It's called Complexity in the Universe. This is the first time that he used the phrase deep object and shallow object. That's actually a very good one. Then there is chapter 7. This is a book that you can get it from Libgen by Paul Whitney and Mingley, called An Introduction to Kolmogorov Complexity and Its Applications. Chapter 7, again on logical depth. Then if you go to my blog, my old blog, which is completely defunct now, it's called Toy Philosophy. If you Google Toy Philosophy, readings on complexity, complexity reading, there is, I would say, a dozen of references to some really great texts, classical texts on complexity.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Absolutely. Anyone?
Well, maybe I jump and say like I was interested in or noticing that in the more in terms of the activism in Latin America, in Colombia in particularly, there is the privilege of the idea of the meshwork, and I think just to, as a comment, just to say that we are trapped in this idea of the network instead of thinking in other forms of, as you say, like political organization. So I'm very hopeful to discover more ways of thinking and complexity. But the thing is that sometimes the language of complexity is like very enclosed, and it's hard to understand it and translate it into other kind of actions.
Unfortunately, that's a pitfall here. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a pitfall. There's a pitfall. Absolutely. I mean, if you read the next text for next sessions, you will also notice this. Absolutely. That there is a certain sort of distance that these absolutely do not translate some of these concepts to, any sort of ordinary vocabulary within which you can create a frame for experimental politics, political organization. Absolutely. But as I said, we try to our best to create an audience, that works. As I said, yes, just recently it wasn't yesterday, just recently I read this interview with Morad Farhadpour. Morad Farhadpour is considered to be one of the greatest intellectuals of the new left in Iran. Quite very, very critical of so many trends and political trends and political responses to the status quo in Iran. And this is what he said, that look, the best thing is to not preach for the faithful. Obviously, you are faithful in the political sense, a lot about this. And I cannot simply just say something that, it's just like, massage the ego of the people who are sympathize with the things. With regard to the sort of understanding of complexity, that needs to be fundamentally, if we are going to do it, needs to be done intuitively at this point. There is no room for technicality. I mean, sure, some technicality may be, but intuitively as best as possible to be done. Yeah. And then Murad Farahpour says that, I was, before the session started, it was saying that because, in Iran, one of the most, particularly during these situations that have been unfolded past few months, but of course these are, have deep roots in Iranian society, and particularly exacerbated by the Islamic Republic of Iran. that there is a tendency toward monarchism, right? So the opposition is monarchism, which would be the other, as Soroush was saying, is the other side of the coin, just like the Islamic Republic of Iran. They are completely one entity, but different from seen from different perspective. So I think that at least when we are talking about these descriptive vocabularies in terms of complexity and stuff, we need to have an understanding that maybe we should now target not just Marxist, not only to be intuitive or be accessible, and not just targeting a Marxist audience, but even right-wingers, right? So I think what I want to do in this class, try to, as best as possible, to stay on a neutral ground, that maybe we can actually have a right-winger who can have a better understanding, right? And moral Farapus says that, like, just for example, with the understanding of monarchy, he says that, okay, let's tell to these monarchists that, well, yes, we can have a good king, right? A good Shah. And it's completely possible that we can have a good Shah. But then, kind of bait them to this sort of understanding that even in Shahnameh, which is the book of the kings written by Ferdowsi, the figure of Khosrow Parviz, who is Kasra, the king of the kings, abdicts himself, not because he's a bad king, he's a great king, he's a magnificent king, but because there is something fundamentally wrong with monarchy, right? This is how we should do it, right? To give tools to people, certain sort of tools with, of course, proper insinuations, not delivered completely neutrally, but within a context that can be assimilated by any sort of audience, that they can go back home and think with these new vocabularies, these new devices, think that maybe this is stuff that I've been thinking about can be changed. Maybe I was on a wrong path, right? Of course, it cannot be done over one night, but that's actually, I think, a good way to move with this sort of what you might call to be moving toward alternatives. Because it shouldn't be just alternative for the left. It should be alternatives for everyone.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So, my dear friends, thank you so much, and I will see you next week. Again, my apologies that we didn't manage to cover anything, but I think that the early discussions were somehow fruitful. Thank you very much, and take care of yourself.
Thank you.
Much, Reza.
Thank you, Reza. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone. Bye-bye.